For those who aren't aware of the history of video games, it is hard to convey how significant a role Ciera Online played in shaping the industry. It is not the goal of this review to cover the history of Ciera, but it is worth having some context at how big and influential Ciera was. Steve Jobs once compared contributing to the computer industry as making a layer of sediment and growing a mountain taller. As a person standing on that surface, it is impossible to see or appreciate any specific layer below you, except for that rare geologist. Ciera's contributions are much like that. Starting from the kitchen table of Ken and Roberta Williams, they helped invent, define, and lead the PC gaming industry from the beginning, creating a billion-dollar public company in the process, lasting into the 90s until the hostile takeover and eventual decline. At their height, they had a 28% market share in the industry. It is easy to forget things that we take for granted, like the mouse, or real music in games. Ciera's size, influence, and earliness is easily overlooked. They moved to point-and-click interfaces before Windows became mainstream and mice weren't necessarily even standard on PCs. They spearheaded the sound card revolution in PCs so full, rich musical scores could be added to games. For a person today, it is hard to see the remnants in the modern world, but consider this small tidbit as a testimonial to their significance. Ciera published the original Half-Life. But for those of us that remember, Ciera is most famous for inventing the graphical adventure game, and their flagship game series was King's Quest, and that's why we're here. After 21 years since King's Quest VII, and 31 years since the original King's Quest debuted, we have a reboot. This is an odd state of affairs because adventure games have been left for dead since the 90s, yet King's Quest and its brethren are still beloved by fans, enough that this reboot happened. This is not going to be a typical review. I almost didn't buy the game, for you see, I become pretty jaded. Every game genre that I enjoyed playing is now considered either a niche or just plain dead. I'm not the type of customer that the mainstream game industry cares to target anymore. So I had a lot of reservations about the new King's Quest 2015 because it couldn't possibly have anything that I like in it, right? Like how most fans received the Star Wars prequels, would this be a King's Quest only in name and not in spirit? After prodding by friends who know of my love of Ciera games, I was pointed to a review by Pushing Up Roses. I've been a fan of her prior videos on the King's Quest series, so I know she is knowledgeable and respect her opinion, so I reluctantly decided to bite. But upon some soul-searching, I realized that my reluctance was not well-defined and a contradiction. I have been craving new Ciera-like games for a long time, and I should welcome something like this. There's been something missing, a void, that modern games haven't filled. And I know I'm not alone in feeling this. The outpouring of support and enthusiasm that made this new King's Quest reboot possible is proof of that. And even before this reboot, there are already fan groups doing their own remakes of the games. Some people have written this off as merely a nostalgia factor, and what I find more infuriating is that those who hate Ciera games tend to drive and dominate the discussion. They grab modern game design principles and point out at how bad Ciera games were, and the conclusion they reach is because they were bad, they are at best a historic relic, and nothing of value was lost. And there is something wrong with people who like Ciera games who don't understand this fact, and the only possible reason they can like it is for nostalgic reasons because the games themselves offer nothing intrinsically, which hasn't already been fixed by modern games of today. What? Ciera games have flaws?
What a smart person you are.
Every Ciera gamer can tell you their own horror story about how they forgot to save, or how they got stuck with a dead end and had to replay, or some stupid puzzle that made no sense. We know Ciera games had deep flaws. Yet despite all these flaws, we found something special about Ciera games that overrode all the negatives, and that absence has only made our hearts grow fonder. Yes, modern games have improved in many areas, but there is still something missing for a lot of us. And Ciera adventure gamers are not alone in this. The current rise of console retro games shows that despite the improvements of modern games, there are a lot of gamers that feel something is missing in their genres. And while the uninformed may simply pass this off as nostalgia, it is easy to identify specific game design grievances. The ability to just start up and go, being able to discover things for yourself without explicit tutorials or affordances, the difficulty level. The same can even be said of the first-person shooter genre, as demonstrated in the hilarious riff of what if Doom and Quake were made today. We have a similar problem with adventure games. Furthermore, it feels like those touting the great advances in modern game design basically cheated with respect to adventure games. Rather than improving adventure games, they simply ignored them and wrote them off. Problem solved. A true Scotsman problem. No real gamer would play adventure games today. And unfortunately, we who love Ciera games, or adventure games at large, have been terrible at figuring out or articulating what we liked about these games. Technically, it's not our job, but it has been nearly 20 years of being marginalized and ignored, and I'm tired of it. I want to get an intelligent dialogue started now, because if there is going to be a serious attempt to resurrect adventure games, I want game designers to not only avoid the mistakes of the past, but truly create something fantastic that the world has never seen before and evolve adventure game design to the next level. So this quote, review unquote, is my initial attempt to figure out what was special about Ciera games. What made them good? What were the things that we liked? What were the things that worked? What void were they filling that is absent from modern games? And of course, since King's Quest 2015 instigated all this, how does it live up? So, my disclaimer, this is an opinionated review. I don't claim to speak for anybody else, and in fact I know my opinions are always in the minority. Being a Ciera game fan who watched the entire adventure game industry implode made it very clear that the rest of the world doesn't share my opinion. My thoughts also tend to be fixated on Ciera-style adventure games, and not necessarily adventure games in general. I should give you a brief background to prove my Ciera game cred, and also give you context about where I'm coming from, because demographically speaking for YouTube, I am probably older than you, so my experience and perspective will be different than yours. To start with, I remember the great video game crash of 1983. I played Ciera 3D adventure games pretty much from the beginning and in order. I didn't play every Ciera game, but I played most of them. Here are some things I recovered that were not lost to time. Ciera games were a social experience in that my friends and I often played them together trying to solve the puzzles. I had a friend with a Roland MT32 and got to hear the games as they are meant to be heard. I was among the losing side that complained on our warranty feedback cards about the switch from text parser to mouse interface. I used to hang out here and inadvertently wrote this article for them. I played most, if not all, of the Ciera fan remake games. I ranked first in the Silver Lining Music Trivia Contest and won a copy of their soundtrack CD. I supported the commercial work of some of these groups and even contributed to a few Kickstarters. My favorite King's Quest was King's Quest 3, though there's something I loved about all of them between 1 through 6. But my favorite Ciera game is Quest for Glory 2, and my favorite non-Ciera adventure game is Star Control 2. And because some people may ask, I played LucasArts adventure games in the later years after the decline of adventure games. I enjoyed them. Some people describe a bitter rivalry among the Ciera fans and LucasArts fans, but I never saw anything like that in circles I met. The bigger issue was probably awareness that LucasArts made adventure games. I personally was preoccupied with these other LucasArts games. My introduction to King's Quest was during the long aftermath of the great video game crash. It is worth remembering that arcades, consoles, and computers had not yet grown cultural divisions, so we played video games anywhere if access was available. Most games were inspired by arcade games, which meant fast response time, action-driven games. When the crash happened, many arcades shut down and stores liquidated all their inventory. I remember games were sold with 100% back mail-in rebates until the inventory cleared, and then there were no more games you could buy at all. In the twilight of the crash, we kept playing those awful Atari 2600 games we had amassed, because that's all we had left. Then one day, in the midst of this drought, my neighbor showed me an IBM PC Junior with King's Quest. I was blown away. Whoa, you can type commands? Oh no, you're gonna drown. What? You can type swim and he'll start swimming? I can hear the river roaring and the forest chirping. Arcades never made sounds to create serene environments. You can pick up objects like that carrot? What else can you pick up? You just climbed a tree and there's a whole new screen to explore. Is every tree an entire new world to explore? Bow to the king? Tempting a goat with a carrot will make them follow a fiddle and they'll start dancing? What else can be done? My imagination was running wild with unlimited possibilities of what could be done. Suffice it to say, I was hooked. As time went on and the video game industry recovered and grew, thanks to friends, I was exposed to all sorts of different systems. Sega Master System, Nintendo, Genesis, Super Nintendo, TurboGrafx 16, Jaguar, 3DO, Saturn, Dreamcast, even Neo Geo, and of course the PC. But even with all these options, Ciera games still stood out as something different and special, and we'd always eagerly anticipate the next Ciera game. So what made Ciera games different? Other games like Zelda and Metroid have similar elements of exploration in a vast, non-linear, dangerous world, yet there are enough differences that we don't consider them the same type of game. Other video game interactions have been about collision boundaries. Does Object A hit Object B? Does Pac-Man touch the ghost? Did your tank bullet hit the Space Invader? What happens when Pengo pushes this block? I don't know if there's an official term to describe this difference in game terminology, so I'm going to refer to this as higher order interactions. This is the first thing I think that made Ciera games and adventure games in general unique and special. We can now interact and affect the world in more nuanced ways that go beyond simple collisions, whether it be shooting or colliding or pushing and pulling. Bowing to the king, tempting a goat with a carrot to change its behavior, playing a fiddle to make leprechauns dance uncontrollably. The idea is that we can affect things indirectly through persuasion or indirect actions, such as posting a sign for passing travelers, or through a simple act of kindness. Even today, I'm hard-pressed to think of games that offer this kind of interaction, especially if you exclude games that can only accomplish this through pre-laid out dialogue selection options. Keep this idea in the back of your mind. It is a subtle point, one that I don't think most people consciously recognize, but it provides some additional and important perspective on the next two major points we're going to discuss. So moving forward, if you ask most Ciera fans, or even the designers, what defines a Ciera game, the two words you will hear most are story and puzzles.
Basically, what intrigued me was the fact that since I am a storyteller, and I've always been a storyteller, was the fact that this was another dimension beyond just a book or a movie, the fact that you could interact with a story and somehow control, or at least get the feeling that you are controlling the story.
And I think, adventure games always have been more about story and exploring and environments and characters.
People got absorbed into the story,
When you're knocking yourself out to create fascinating characters and explore new genres. I loved the old Infocom games and text adventures from other companies too. And I always thought that one of the real joys of adventure games was being rewarded for thinking of things that the designer had already anticipated and provided a specialized response for.
Accept 8-bit graphics and just go for the story and for the characters and the dialogue and so forth. A whole new world will open up to you. And
to begin, let's focus on story, and I'm going to open with this. Story is really tricky to talk about because it is so easy to focus on the wrong things, missing what is really important. A lot of people say stories in games suck today, and they want better stories. So the obvious solution is, why not just get the best writers from books or cinema and throw them at the game? Because there are other things that players want as well. First, it is a game, so we want interactivity. We want to feel like we have an impact on the story, or agency. And we want the freedom to do what we want, autonomy. At the same time, we don't want the story to feel like it is tacked on, which makes it feel shallow or pointless. And we want the story to feel coherent and harmonious.
And games now that are purported to be great stories are really kind of just a little story tacked on to a whole lot of,
it's definitely an afterthought.
Repetitive gameplay.
Yeah.
There and said, what can we do with what they do well, which is present an adventure game? And, one of our frustrations with, Ultima games was that it didn't really have a rich story. It promised there was story, but they were just, little bits and pieces of story, and it really didn't tell a coherent, really good D&D style adventure where you really felt like there's this moving, sweeping event going on, and we wanted to put that in a game.
People are very good at sensing when a story is incongruent or conflicted with itself or other elements of the game. But why can't the best writers solve this too? Well, let's assume for the moment that these problems are just a skill problem. The reality is that writers are not trained to deal with any of these problems. Children in schools are taught 3-act story structures with a beginning, middle, and end. Not, your story still must make sense if I shuffle all your pages around and randomly change your paragraphs. Not to mention that most writers probably dream of writing the next great screenplay for Hollywood or winning a Pulitzer, not the ungrateful task of writing something that most players will skip through by hitting A. Which in itself belies another question. Why do we have such disjointed mechanisms for gameplay and story, and then cram them together? I'll come back to this later, but it should be no surprise that with the huge risks and costs of production pipelines in modern games, companies have little incentive to risk missing a ship date or paying to redo art assets and voice acting simply because the story is found deficient. But even if we could fix all these types of obstacles, there is still a fundamental conflict between interactivity and story. Indie developer Jonathan Blow, creator of Braid, and currently working on his own adventure game, The Witness, gave an hour-long talk entitled Fundamental Conflicts in Contemporary Game Design, where he gives a thorough discussion of the problems and challenges of stories in games. While it will be demoralizing for anybody who wants better stories in games, it is a talk I highly recommend, and I will link to it below. His premise is that making meaningful stories in games is extremely difficult to solve, not just because we have a lack of skilled writers, and not just because of business incentives, but because there are intrinsic conflicts between interactivity and stories. Let me illustrate this. I'm going to solve the problem of weak stories by writing a terrific story. This is going to be the greatest story ever because I'm going to make it a grand, epic adventure with your pal, the goat. You'll help each other throughout the game, overcoming all sorts of obstacles, and I'm going to build in this awesome theme with tons of subtext about how we can build a better world for tomorrow simply by man embracing nature and living in harmony with animals. What's that player doing with that knife?
Enough smarm already. Let's funeral.
This one was pretty obvious, and you might say, just limit my autonomy and avoid the problem. And maybe you can carefully design the game so that I never get a knife and thus never think about killing the goat. But consider another problem involving comedic or dramatic delivery.
In all of comedy, what is the most important thing?
Timing!
Ahem. I said, in all of comedy...
Timing!
Again. I said, in all of comedy, what is the most important thing?
Timing!
Correct.
As with comedy, drama also requires careful framing and timing.
In games, you don't know where the player just came from, right? You don't know if he's holding a gun in his hand or some flowers, you don't know if he's wearing like pants or what. As a designer, we could try to approach that problem and pre-author a bunch of content or think in advance about everything the player might do. But as we know, this invites a combinatorial explosion that we just can't deal with, right? You cannot think about all these things in advance. You cannot pre-bake that content. My favorite illustration of this is shown in these pictures here. It's a walkthrough of the game Deus Ex from the comedy site Old Man Murray, where their instructions to the player for the walkthrough, in the beginning of the game, you go through this military base and you get all your instructions, and they said, hey, pick up that big American flag in the lobby and just stick it in front of everybody that you're about to talk to, right? And it makes every situation completely ridiculous, because you're talking to this guy and he's like, oh, Agent Denton, we need you to infiltrate the Statue of Liberty and kill all the terrorists, and you're going to need these weapons to do it. And he's like super serious and stuff. There's this American flag that you're like waving in his face, and there was no way for the designers to anticipate that, right? This happens with everything in every game that we make, right? I just like this because it's an extremely prominent reminder of that.
Now you might argue, well, the player is just intentionally sabotaging that, so we don't really need to worry about that because they aren't going to care about the story anyway. But the problem is worse than that. Here is another example of a common mistake that pretty much every modern game makes, and King's Quest 2015 has a particularly egregious example. Dialog. In the beginning of the game, you will walk into a field meeting the merchant for the first time. I didn't press any buttons, I didn't try to interact with the guy or the wagon, I just walked into the field. This triggers a 1 minute and 25-second unskippable monologue by the merchant, which you must wait through no matter how many times you slam the spacebar. If you, the game designer, are forcing me to listen to the dialogue when I don't want to, you have failed. Perhaps your dialogue sucked, or perhaps your voice actors sucked. But let's assume both of these are brilliant. The problem is timing. I didn't want this, at least not now, but I'm getting a mountain of exposition. I was in the middle of adventuring and this character stopped me. Maybe I might want to say hello or ask a concise question like, what do you need? But that should come from me, at my option, on my timetable and my terms. And because this was thrust upon me, no matter how great the dialogue is, I am not invested and not interested. This is another example of story and interactivity in conflict. And the irony is that the industry doesn't seem to really understand these problems, so when they try to address the problems of bad stories in games, their solution seems to be just to pile on more bad stuff, more linearity and less interactivity to avoid disharmony. double down on more dialogue, regulate it to cutscenes, interspersed with gameplay to avoid timing problems. And this may be one of the reasons for the decline of adventure games. Ciera nor anybody else ever perfected or mastered this technique. Balancing story and interactivity was a constant challenge. I personally felt that the heavy push towards full motion video in the later days of Ciera was a mistake, because it usually came at the expense of interactivity, because your path had to be filmed, and there was limited storage space and production time. And with FMV means actors, which means dialogue, and designers were also emboldened to put in more exposition instead of gameplay. But when Ciera was at its best, it succeeded where most failed. Despite improbability, Ciera built an entire company of storytelling games and did so for 20 years. Though imperfect, their stories were far better than most, enough such that even a jaded cynic like me doesn't roll their eyes when I hear the terms story and game used together when talking about a Ciera game. So the questions we need to ask are, what did Ciera do to make this work better, and can we harness those techniques to improve things? Perhaps Ciera games were small enough to make the combinatorial problem manageable. Perhaps the audience is already receptive to giving up a certain amount of autonomy. If so, what defines those limits? Perhaps the designers were willing to allow more agency than force a story. In football terms, they play zone defense instead of always trying to force a turnover. These are open questions, but I want to turn our attention to puzzles, which is the other property special to adventure games. Story can provide us with context about ourselves, our environment, and the motivation for what we are doing. You are a janitor in a spacesuit with magnetic boots, sweeping the outer deck to avoid getting yelled at by your boss. But unlike other storytelling mediums, in a game, the story should be designed to support our sense of agency, that our actions matter, that we are active participants in making the story unfold, not simply along for the ride. So if story needs to be designed around supporting our agency, puzzles are the component that let us explore our agency. But what do we mean by puzzles? How we perceive Tetris, an adventure game, are very different in nature. So now I return to the earlier notion of higher order interactions. In an adventure game, a puzzle can act as a bridge to the story. It is a way to express a decision or intent in the story. We don't actually solve the Kubik's Rube, but we use it to preoccupy the Labian Terror Beast. If our only mechanic was jumping or shooting, our ability to express these higher level notions would be very difficult. So this is why puzzles and adventure games became intertwined. This is one of the few ways to express agency in a story that required higher level concepts than could be gleaned from collision boundaries. And this is why adventure game storytelling stands out as something stronger. Puzzles allow us to integrate and coordinate core gameplay directly with story, rather than interspersing the two, which contributes to that tacked-on feeling. But the track record for puzzles in adventure games is hit and miss. It is fair criticism that adventure games never advanced like other game genres because they couldn't get to the essence of what a puzzle should be. Fetch quests, inventory puzzles, pixel hunts, logic puzzles, dialogue puzzles, everything is all over the map, and it isn't even the case that all these puzzles directly relate to the story, but merely obstacles to slow down the progress of your game. Coming into this review, I thought we all had a pretty strong notion of what bad puzzles were. For example, I thought everybody hated pixel hunts. But on further reflection, I'm not so sure anymore.
And you still open doors by shooting slingshots at eyeballs in the wall. Is that a puzzle? Like, seriously, is that a puzzle? Is looking around the room and finding an eyeball on a wall really super fun for people? Is stopping your forward motion, stopping everything, to look for a diamond to whack that's in a soulless crevice in the wall so you can open a door that leads to another room with a locked door and some other silly open sesame trick? Is that fun? Is this what you want? Hey, come on, man, it's not that bad.
But while ripping on bad puzzles is a lot of fun, it doesn't get us anywhere because we still don't have a solid grasp on what constitutes a good puzzle. So I'd like to direct our attention here. The knee-jerk reaction has been to use traditional techniques of storytelling, text, dialogue, exposition. But in film, the saying is, show, don't tell. In games, it should be play, don't show or tell. King's Quest 2015 used a lot of speech and exposition to try to make us connect with the characters, and personally, it didn't really work for me. Being forced to take a test on everybody's name was a horrible abuse of video game exposition. I don't care what Whisper's full name is when
we have adventuring to do.
And there are so many potentially interesting ways to introduce a squirrel that lives under a guy's armor through gameplay. It's shameful. In contrast, the most successful character in the game was the character that only uses 6 words.
Achaka.
Instead of exposition, the game let me share an adventure with him through gameplay. Much, much better. But even this fell back on traditional narrative tropes with linear cutscenes. I want to push game designers to do better, so consider the following.
Then I want to go to this issue of humanity and empathizing with a character in a game, right? So Bioshock has the little sister who you're kind of supposed to empathize with as being helpless. It's this very architected choice, right? Do you save the little sister or kill the little sister, right? Portal has the weighted companion cube, which is not even a character, right? It's a box with a texture map on it. But it happened in an explorational way. The way it happened was the team decided it would be cool to have a level with a bunch of puzzles where you carry a crate from one end to the other, using it in different ways and with the portals and stuff to circumvent all these puzzles, right? They noticed that people felt kind of weird about like getting rid of their crate at the end of the level after doing all that stuff. So then they contrived this whole great situation where the narrator computer pretends that this is like your imaginary pet rock kind of friend, and you cannot exit the level without throwing this crate in the incinerator and being accused of murdering it, right? And this actually works really well. It works at least as well as Bioshock. So here's a poster on the Quarter to 3 forum saying, it's a measure of Bioshock's quality. He disagrees with me. He actually likes Bioshock, but we'll go on. It's a measure of Bioshock's quality that killing little girls actually made me, a jaded and manipulative gamer, feel guilty and slightly uncomfortable, but Portal actually made me guilty and slightly uncomfortable about throwing a crate into a pit. That's pretty damn impressive. And it's true. I had exactly the same reaction. I tried for 20 minutes to like outwit the computer and somehow open the door without putting the crate into the pit. It wasn't possible, and I eventually gave up and I murdered him. But, what else are you going to do? So what I have to get from that is maybe just the idea that this traditional way that we think about when we try to design a game for people to empathize with, like the Alex Vance kind of thing or the little sister kind of thing, where we try to make this very human character that interacts with you a lot, maybe that's the wrong direction, or maybe it's not the only direction, and maybe gameplay itself can give us some other things.
So we really need to think of puzzles as part of the storytelling. And if puzzles are the player's gateway to agency, this may even suggest that we have it backwards, and that stories should serve puzzles instead of the other way around. But at the very least, thinking about the two as interconnected peers may allow designers to get into a better mindset. Here's a real example. In Space Quest 3, the designers wanted to do two things with the story at the beginning of the game. They needed to bridge the ending events of Space Quest 2, where you are stuck in an escape pod in suspended animation, and they wanted to give you your own ship that you would use for the rest of the game. They created a garbage freighter for the entire first act of the game. Their mentality was that this freighter was one elaborate puzzle to allow you to earn your way to freedom by repairing a derelict ship, not simply little bits of cutscene stories with random unconnected puzzles.
Here's a question from Slipgate. Did the game design of the junk freighter get planned out in advance or after the fact?
We planned out the freight. We definitely planned out the freight and the puzzles. We knew we needed a puzzle, some way to bring the Mallard to life.
Right, so yeah, this whole thing was a designed puzzle for sure.
In the next leg, we will look at some important properties needed to make story-oriented puzzles effective. Then, we'll bring everything together and demonstrate some good puzzle examples.